Thank you very much, ladies, for joining me on stage. So to kickstart this session, I would like to do a short introduction to each of your roles and the kind of steps and developments you've seen in this issue over your career so far. So to kickstart things, Sarah, you were based in Asia in the sort of early noughties, actually as a former colleague of mine back at CNBC, and then went back to the UK and have since come out to Asia. And over that time, you've been kind of covering the private sector. So what are some of the developments you've seen over that time and the comparisons you can make between working in Asia and working back in Europe?
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to chat with these women. We had a nice time getting to know each other at lunch. So 25 years ago, I came to Singapore for the first time, and I've worked here 3 times. So It's been an extraordinary journey, as anyone who's known Singapore for a long time will recognize, seeing the change. Clearly, some things are not changing fast enough, and I think the theme that we have here, accelerating through diversity, is one that is really worthy to focus on. So I think you mentioned the statistic around 12%.
Yeah.
So S&P Global, we've been doing some research lately, looking at women on boards globally, and particularly in a sector that I'm very close to, which is energy.
Right.
And we've seen over the past decade, we've seen that number of women on boards increase.
Okay.
So we see progress, and we're really encouraged by that. What we see, however, is that if we wait and continue to see the progress at the current rate, we're going to be looking till, I think it's 2058 to get gender parity on boards. You know, and I sort of recognize that will put my daughter in her 50s and my son close to that. I would like to see faster progress. And I think, you know, the efforts that a meeting like this makes and the push to drive for faster development is one that, you know, we're very, very keen to support, given that research that we've seen. A couple of, you know, that's the data. Anecdotally, in this region, as you mentioned, I was a colleague at CNBC and in other media outlets as well. I'm really seeing the representation of women in media becoming a much stronger issue. You know, certainly when I worked at CNBC many, many years ago, it wasn't such a big consideration. I know now, for example, your own company, Bloomberg, and many of the big media outlets, BBC, are making this a priority. And, you know, it may sound like a divergence from the topic, but actually you can't be what you don't see.
What you can't see, exactly.
And if you don't see women, you don't see role models on the TV talking about their expert fields, if you don't see women quoted in the media, it's just one of the ways that women can get that exposure and other people can see that this is a possibility for me to progress to this level. So we still have a great deal more work to do. We've been pushing very hard on our hashtag change pays, and I really, you know, I do want to push that for the right reasons. I'd love it if we had more followers from this conference to that hashtag, because I think it's so important that we start to recognize the contribution that women could make. One last point, if I may. If the US had kept up with Norway in terms of promoting and hiring women, we'd be seeing the US economy about 1.6 trillion larger than it is currently. So I think, you know, those are numbers that we should stick to.
And we see time and again, the figures are there, the proof is there that the diversity does pay off, but there's just not that momentum. We're still not seeing that. But yeah, that's a very interesting point about you can't be what you can't see, and it's nice, it's kind of heartening to hear that you think there's more representation in the media. It is something we tried to do at CNBC, not having any of these manuals that I think have been so common in the past. So it's about getting the image out there and making it more available. And for you, Louise, you've kind of spent decades in the kind of public sector and working with governments across Europe. How have you seen the kind of agenda shift and conversation around women in boards evolve over that time?
Yeah, well, I think there's no doubt that women on boards and diversity generally is on the agendas of European governments. I think the picture's still a bit dismal, to tell you the truth. If you look at the statistics, the percentage of women on boards in big European publicly listed companies is still under 27%, just under 27%. In 12 member states of the European European Union, men outnumber women 4-1.
Wow.
And in 3 member states of the European Union, and I'm going to call them out because we have to call them out, and that's Malta, Greece and Latvia, there are less than 10% of women on boards of listed companies, and that's clearly disappointing. And having said that, as the French minister was saying yesterday, there are a number of member states that now have binding quotas, and I know the Q word is very controversial.
Yeah, certainly get to that.
But France, Germany, Italy and Belgium all have binding quotas, and there's no doubt that that's changing the landscape in those countries. Those countries which don't have binding quotas in the European Union, 12 of them have actually introduced other changes to try and support women reach senior positions both in the private and the public sector. For example, in the UK now there are reviews, companies have to report on pay parity every year, and this has really forced companies to address the issue, and it's shining a light on the disparities between men and women. There have also been steps to encourage companies to self-regulate, and that is working as well, because companies of course don't want to be regulated, and so if there is a government policy which is actually encouraging companies to change the way they behave, they try and address that quite seriously. The one thing that I would say as well is that I think the public sector or government at the political level is really trying to lead by example. And again, we all heard from the French minister yesterday, President Macron's aim to have equal numbers of men and women in his leading his government. Similarly, at EU level, there's going to be a new European Commission, as many of you know, which will come into take office in November. For the first time, there's going to be a female president of the European Commission, German, Ursula von Leyen, and for the first time ever, there's going to be an equal number of men and women as European commissioners. And this is very motivating. It's something business takes note of and recognises, that times need to change. So, my take on it all is, it's good in parts, but there's still a long way to go.
So it's heartening, I suppose, to think where the things you're seeing now versus a few decades ago, but there's a long way clearly to go. And Gabrielle, you've kind of traversed both of these sectors, the public and the private. Are there comparisons you can make? Are there lessons, do you think, that can be learned from one side to another?
Well, that's a pretty good question. Actually, I would say 10 years ago, it was very different in the public sector or state-owned companies, because there was no visibility, there was no pressure from the outside. And also something very important, some of the board members were sitting at the board simply because they were representing ministries or other institutions. So they were appointed not on their personal qualities or skills or whatever, but simply because, you needed someone to represent like the Ministry of Transportation, so boom, you were appointed, or you needed someone to represent the Treasury, boom, it was you. So now that we have less state-owned companies, this is changing. So I would say that 10 years ago, something like that, yes, there was a big difference. Diversity was not such a hot topic in public sector or state-owned companies, but that's completely different now. And how you were saying now, public sector also needs to lead by example. So I think that today, you take a public listed company, public sector, state-owned company, you would not see much differences.
No.
You would see differences maybe between controlled companies and companies that are not controlled. That's the difference I would see. And globally, what you see is women in boards are in increasing number. I'm very proud to say that France is leading the way with 44% of women in board now, which is a very, very good figure. So we could talk about why we have 44% of women in board in France, but only 17% at the executive committee level, but maybe not today. Today we are going to focus on board and focus on Asia, and maybe to see how we can learn from what happened in Europe, how law enforcement actually made a difference and made some pressure on the business to move, how you could do this in Asia. And maybe just one last point before we go into the how to make progress is the why.
Yeah.
Why do we want women on boards? Why? So we know there is plenty of studies on the impact it could have on growth, on sustainability, because women pay more attention to sustainability, on ethical business practices. We could also say that it's just fair, because we are 50% of the population.
Yeah.
I would add just two things. One, I read a study that was kind of funny, actually, which was that when you have women on board, it tempers the overconfidence of male CEOs.
Okay.
So I thought it was, something to remember. And something else is because I've seated on a number of boards, I've seen how diversity could change the conversation.
Yeah.
And if I can take one or two quick examples, in a very commercial-driven company, what I've seen is the women on board were the one talking about consumer insights and how women consumers would react.
Yeah.
And in another one, which was a company under a lot of pressure, transformation with poor results, etc., this is a woman who asked a question about engagement. How are the employees understanding the strategy, etc.?
Yeah.
No of the male in the room asked the question. So I think it brings a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, some very interesting points that I certainly want to return to, talking about the quotas and the practicalities of implementing more diversity in boards. But just moving on to Helena now, I'd like you to speak about your perspective. You're very kind of au fait with the Chinese market in particular, and also startups. What are you seeing startups doing in terms of trying to promote diversity on boards?
Well, I see that I'm the only Chinese face on board, so I will speak about this matter from a typical Chinese perspective, I guess. So maybe some of you may be aware of this. 5 years ago, the central government in Beijing published the Mass Entrepreneurship and Innovation Policy, as we call it, 双创. So as a direct consequence to this government-led initiative, we have seen over the past 5 years a strong supply of startups driven by men and women that even outstrip the numbers of the Western society in Silicon Valley, for example. And I have been a close observer, I would say, to the growth journey of some of today's Chinese tech unicorns. The $50 billion worth of Ant Financial, led by Liu Xipeng, and then Didi Chuxing, the $30 billion valued taxi, the transportation platform led by Liu Qing, another female leader that I personally admire a lot. And we have the $4 billion valued VIP Kit, an exponentially growing English learning platform that has captured the attention of global investors, that has been growing exponentially over the past 3 years, driven by Yuan Juan, a lovely Chinese woman in her mid-30s. So we've seen more and more of those strong, independent, exemplary women emerging in the boards of fast-growing tech unicorns, which I think sends a very positive signal. But there's still some prevailing issues for either tech unicorns or large enterprise in general in Asia, because I'm from China, but I've been a resident in Singapore for the past 6 years. So I'll speak about things that I'm more familiar with. And based on my observation, because this strong supply of venture startups in China has only been a phenomenon for less than a decade, a little bit lagging behind of the Western society in Europe or the United States, for example. So in certain aspect, there's still lacking a sound corporate board governance in a lot of the venture startups, and typically so in those large unicorns. So if we give this this issue, the corporate governance, a historical perspective, we'll see that the corporate governance has gone through a radical revolution over the past half a century. And there was a long period, and along with that comes with the transformation, I would say, of emotional landscape. And there was a long period of managerial domination in corporate hierarchy of manipulative and jungle fighter kind of bosses that was rewarded until this phenomenon was challenged in the 1980s by the advent of two phenomena. One is globalization, and the other is information technology.
Yeah.
So the corporate governance dominated by those manipulative jungle fighter boss represent the typical board management in the past. And the other end of the spectrum, we have a well-managed board characterized by diversity, consensus making, and a lot of those merits that represent what's coming to happen in the future.
Yeah. So
and I think we are seeing this trend happening in China, but it's going to take time.
Yeah.
But with the emerging supply of women's role in the board in tech startups, I think we're seeing a good momentum coming.
Okay, nice.
And I think diversity, I think it's all about fostering a culture of managing by heart, not just managing by heads. And I think we women leaders have this innate talents of fostering consensus, nurturing diversity, and also the empathetic thinking.
Yeah. I'd certainly like to come back to that as well, and some of the traits that I think women can contribute to the boards to enhance them. But just moving on to you, Kaori, you're a founder yourself, and now you kind of advise other female board members in Japan. What are your observations? What are the challenges that you've come up against?
All right. So I'm from Tokyo, Japan, and I'm an entrepreneur, started like 2 companies 30 years ago. So a long way to go to come here. And I'm currently sitting on board for 3 listed companies and former 3 listed companies. So like huge companies for 12 years already. So it happened because the door was open from inside, which is male decisions, male's decision that they opened their door for the boards. And it's happening in Japan because recently, like a Prime Minister Abe has requested the business association. That was like 6-7 years ago, twice. And that kind of Prime Minister's message to the business male leaders were very powerful. So they reluctantly or without knowing why, but they started to open the doors. And also that by last couple of years that we had a couple of laws to ask public companies to disclose the number of women on board and so forth as a very important value to invest and so forth. So people are now finally aware of at least counting, and also they're competing with other companies. And then now that the Prime Minister has also messaged to the other company, more than 101 employees has to have at least 1 woman on board. So there's no penalty or anything, but because of that kind of leadership and the load making, the Japan has slowly but surely changing. The how slow it was is like in 2012, the women on board was only 630 people. Women. Well, actually, when I am doing 3 companies and I'm counted at 3, right? So it's not actually not the real women number, but the 630 positions in 2012, and it was only 1.6% of the board members. And last year, 2018, it became 1,705 positions by women, which is only 4% 0.1%, but it's like a triple as well. So it's surely, slowly but surely, it's increasing. That's the Japan case. And I myself has been running the largest women's and diversity conference for the last 30 years. More than 1,000 women and men get together in a big conference. That would be also a wave and change the atmosphere of the society. Also, I started the diversity index to measure an organization's of diversity-ness, not only counting the number of women on percentage on board or executives, but actually we do an online individual survey linked to the employee ID, so that including CEO, that how much they know about diversity, not only the gender issue, but actually the disabilities and ethnicities and so forth included. So we know what to do and what to teach and who to teach and what kind of training is needed. And then we are interested in analyzing it with the profitability and growth rate and ROE in 3-5 years.
Great, thank you. Now, I'd like to speak about the kind of practicalities of this issue and whether we think there are any specific issues in Asia that is keeping this number particularly low. We see it's 12.4%, and of course we can't kind of judge all of Asia is a very big region, and it's very different in different markets. We see maybe higher figures in Australia, for example, versus other places. But do you think there are any particular challenges that Asia faces that is preventing this progress? Perhaps one for you, Carrie, yeah.
Maybe it's because of the family values and so forth, I would say. That it's changing. Even in Japan, it depends on the city.
Yeah.
The Tokyo is more international, and the global and new way of thinking is introduced. So that there is so many men taking care of the domestic work and helping kids, and or working together, or even staying at home and helping the wife to work. But when you go out of Tokyo, local cities and rural areas, and of course a lot of the culture differences. The funny story is like about maybe 15 years ago, when the dishwasher were introduced to the families, the TV commercial was saying that this is the wise way to save time, Then it sold well, but a lot of the mother-in-law claimed that, my daughter-in-law do not even wash dishes, right? So that they changed the commercial into that wise wives and wise women use this because it's saving water and it's eco-friendly. That kind of direction, then it was much more sold. So that the different way of explanation that could change the cultural stumbling block and so forth, I would say, if I make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the point. How do we change this? There may be these traditions, these long-standing traditions or expectations of women, but what do you think can be done to shift that? Are there any learnings that you've perhaps seen in your work across Europe where that has helped move the conversation?
I mean, maybe I can kick off.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly sort of women's networking and women talking together and supporting each other has an important role to play. And, my observation from a European perspective is really since, the early, maybe 2012, something like that, when diversity issues really came onto the agenda in a political way, you saw then a setting up of many women's networking groups. And so one question I'd ask my Asian colleagues is, how strong are those women's networking groups in your market? If I look at Brussels, for example, where I'm based, there's an absolute plethora of them. It's not just companies like FTI Consulting, for example. We have our own women's networking group in Brussels where we network also with people in the Brussels market. But that, in fact, is a global networking group, women's networking group for FTI around the world. So I have contacts here with the female networking team here. But just as companies have women's networking groups, so there are, women in law networking groups, or women working in trade policy, or women working in financial services. And I think that that can be particularly helpful and encouraging for young women. But the one word of caution here, ladies, everybody, and that is, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, in as much as there are many men out there, particularly younger men, new men, who absolutely want to help, who are on message, could become wonderful ambassadors for us. And there are also older men who I have certainly experienced have been excellent mentors over the year. So when we have our, I'm not saying dispose of our women's networking groups, I think they're invaluable, but somehow, sometimes we have to include the men and sort of recruit the men to help move things forward. And I would suggest probably that applies in Asia as much as it would apply in Europe.
Good point. And Gabrielle, I know you get to say
I was thinking about actually your question and your comment, etc. And I would say that if we want to change the situation and increase diversity, and by the way, I fully agree that it's about diversity. We don't want to have a board looking like this panel. Okay, so if we want to increase diversity,
there are men out in the audience as well, but I agree.
I would say we have four things to do. One, it's to address the cultural topic. And we were talking about the culture in some Asian countries, but it's not only in Asia.
No.
So we have to fight against bias, and sometimes unconscious bias. And it's true in both directions, if I may, because sometimes women believe that men are discriminating against them. So this is, I think, something extremely important. Second one is to push for diversity. So this is what we are doing today with the Women's Forum, to push for lawmakers to act, to push for investors to say something, okay? Because actually, they're a bit too silent. You see that BlackRock is writing a letter to companies with not enough female directors. Fine, but they still vote. No problem. We see things changing. I don't know if you've seen the WeWork IPOs. People are complaining that they have a male-only board. So this is good sign, I guess. Third is to create a pipeline of female talent. This is extremely important to make sure that we help women reach leadership role. And it also touches upon what we were talking about, which is childcare, how the tasks are shared at home between men and women, flexible time, equal pay, all this stuff. I mean, all of this is critical to make sure that women can achieve their goals. And my fourth one is, once you are in the boardroom, what do you do? And this is our responsibility, to be super good board members, to be extremely active, to be members of the committees, to try and chair the committees, and maybe one day to chair the board. But that's our responsibility to lean in.
Absolutely, and to be laying the groundwork for then your successors after that. Was there something you wanted to add, Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's worth adding that, this conversation, the room of people we have here, everybody's shown up because they're already interested in this topic and probably already on a particular side of it, right? They all want equality. So I think, we have to leave this room inspired to go and carry that message further. And I think that really does come down to carrying that to all the men in our lives. So whether that's a partner, a son, a brother, a colleague, we've got to think really carefully about the language we use to describe each other and to have those conversations. We've got to think really carefully about how we raise our children. I think there's a lot of focus, and I hear it a lot. Oh, well, I have a daughter, so, I'm trying to raise her to be strong and brave and courageous, take risks and be ambitious. But I think it's also really important to understand that if you're raising one of each, or if you're raising a boy, help them also see that there's a whole world of possibilities for both genders, for everybody. And I think that is critical. I don't like to see my daughter waiting on my son, though he would certainly allow her to do that if I let them. So I think it really starts at home. And if we look at the situation in Asia, I think this is something that, after spending 12 years here, I feel that I can comment on, is at work we see that a lot of the burden of home falls to the women. So when it's Chinese New Year, or it's Ramadan, we think about giving, people ask us, can we go home early because I need to help cook the dinner, or I need to help prepare for the dinner this evening, and we get much more of those requests from women than we do from men. And I think we want to work in a place where we give people that flexibility, and we absolutely do, but it would be great to see childcare and parent care and care for the elderly being shared much more widely across all the demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. Helena, would you be able to...
I think it's a lovely perspective, Sarah, to present your thoughts as a mother, and I guess that makes a certain percentage of the audience resonate as well, because I guess we have many mommies in our audience today. I think paramount is to get the private and public sectors united and work as a coherent force to combat this challenge. We are facing a challenge of fostering more diversity in board management. I agree with Ana Gabriel in terms of changing the perception of a woman, and I think the private sector, those large corporates and even startups who have successfully raised B rounds, C rounds of funding, can play a very instrumental role in changing this traditional perception on women as an emotional being. What is emotion? I think we're going through a huge transformation on the emotional landscape and have come to a point where we need to recognize the significance of being emotional. A lot of males consider women as emotional animals, and they often consider that as a negative attribute. Is it really so? I don't agree.
No.
I think emotion, creativity, the ability of fostering consensus and diversity are hugely undervalued intellectual capital that is not yet appreciated by lots of males on the board. So I am currently sitting on 3 boards in Italy, in Beijing, and in Singapore. And whenever we have a board meeting, I'm always the one there to mitigate the conflicts and to facilitate consensus. And it's a little bit funny to see those board members, fellow board members of mine, arguing with each other without thinking of the bigger picture. And yet I'm there, the only female, normally regarded as the emotional one, can sit there calmly and facilitate the big picture thinking. So I think we should encourage more campaigns that empower women's natural attributes, such as empathy, such as mind of diversity, such as creativity, and such as being emotional. And I think Women's Forum is a hell of a great platform to aggregate women thought leaders who put their voices out there and empower more women to go for their dreams, to put their voices out there and stand for themselves. And I think there should be more of such platforms in the world and in Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. And I really like that point as well on the fact that there needs to be more value attributed to the emotional kind of intelligence that women traditionally, typically have. And I think perhaps as we're seeing a lot of disruption from technology and the need for more of these EQ skills, maybe that will become a more valuable kind of attribute that we can
Talking about group IQ, right?
Yeah.
It's not about one dominant male leader. It is about the true art of leadership is not about dominance, but about bringing people together, working towards the same goal. And that's what we women are good at.
Yeah, and being able to kind of get that backing from all your team members and your staff. Now, we've spoken about some of the different suggestions about how we can kind of encourage diversity at the board level, but it's still slow progress. And that moves me on to the point of these quotas, which I think is something that we've seen a lot of advancement in different geographies from. So what role do you think they play in advancing this conversation in Asia? What experience do you have, Sarah?
So my experience is that I used to be militantly opposed to quotas because I felt afraid that I would be seen as somebody who got a job based on a law, or I was, somebody forced to give me a job. And so I used to think it was a terrible idea. I have moved from that position.
Yeah.
I think, unless we, when you see the progress that's been made in countries where measures have been taken, I think it's undeniable that those things are working well for women, they're working well for businesses, and I think that is something that we should be thinking about more holistically, more globally. So I'm now in a position where I think that there may be a need to be more aggressive around this and to push a bit harder, because I think, as I said, if we wait till 2058, that's too long.
Yeah,
I don't want to wait that long. So I think it's time. I think we should be more bold, and we should be more demanding of our politicians and of our business leaders to push this forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Completely agree, 100%. And from exactly the same starting point, was opposed to quotas when I was younger, but it's just moved too slowly. And I see my 25-year-old daughter facing the same problems and issues that I faced when I was 25, and that's just not acceptable. So absolutely for quotas.
And Gabrielle?
I would say the same, actually. I was opposed to quotas.
Yeah.
Because, no one wants to be a quota. I'm sure that in the room, no one would like to be a quota. But when you see the result, wow. And you know why? Because of quotas, they have to go and find the women. So they go, they look for them, and guess what? They find them.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean they're any less deserving. They're just opening it out. Completely. Carrie?
So I'm for a quota. Yeah. So especially in Japan, the equal opportunity law started 30 years ago, but the wise men has they're named differently from men's work to women's work, but they have the general work to clerical work, and they are saying that they have no discrimination towards women. However, that almost 99% goes to the women to the clerical work and general work, which is the management track, is for the men. So it didn't really happen naturally. So I really think that the quota is needed, especially for Japan. At least for like maybe 15 years of time. Well, that's fine. There's some kind of duration is needed, but we have to have those target and durations, and so that they are making effort. And while doing that, we have to show that how profitable it is for them, because diversity is not just equal opportunity things. This is the diversity leads innovation. And diversity is not just the increasing the number of women, it's increasing the ideas on the table. Or so in the future, it's nothing to do with the gender or generation or nationality. It's just the matter of what kind of contribution that individual will do to the company or to the society. That's the diversity. So, but on the way to go there, we need the quota, and we have to really push forward. One more thing that I really do believe that networking is very important, and showing the role model is very important. That's why that I've been doing this big conference in Japan for 30 years. But I really come up to the conclusion that the most important thing is increasing the experience of that. Because the wise leaders, male and female, they do know that diversity is needed. And then they know definitions, and they can answer perfect answers. But they have not experienced, they haven't really knowing from the bottom of their heart. So bringing them to the conference like this, or having lunch or meeting together and discuss about this matter, the more experience they have exposed to this kind of issue, then they would learn, and they started understanding and taking action on it.
Absolutely. Now, I'm conscious we're running out of time here, but what I would love is for each of you to maybe just give a piece of advice from the audience on how they can push this quota agenda and try and make small steps in their own work life to try and maybe encourage this diversity and this conversation when they're back in their work. Sarah?
Okay, I'll take a shot. So I think the messaging is really, really important. I think it's very critical for our colleagues, particularly our male colleagues, to understand this is not about being selfish. This is not about trying to dominate. This is not about trying to take other people's jobs. The message has to be that female inclusion in the workforce around the world is a force for good. So our own research at S&P Global shows the global economy could be $4.87 trillion bigger if women around the world were included at the same rate as men. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think if anyone's read Melinda Gates' book, The Moment of Lift, that's another thing that really inspires me. The more we can get women into positions of power around the world, whether that's on boards, as business leaders, as politicians, wherever that might be, the more likely it is that women in developing economies are going to have access to the kind of resources and healthcare and economic development that they deserve. Yeah. And I feel that, you know, in a little way, by advancing our own agenda and making sure that we're leading, we're helping other women around the world to be able to see that that is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Louise, a quick takeaway. So we've got
messaging, that's very important. Okay, a quick takeaway. On the topic of quotas, you said how to advance quotas, because we all seem to be sort of in agreement about the value of quotas. And France, in particular, your 44%, for example, it speaks for itself. Yeah. I mean, the way to get quotas, the only way to get that is to get political support for it and to get legislation changed. Yeah. That is very challenging in certain markets, but it does work. A message for women, I think, is you have to be brave. You have not to worry about, how you might necessarily be received. You've got to be brave. You've got to push back, and you've got to be prepared to challenge people in leadership roles to make change. Yeah. And at an event this morning, for example, somebody was telling me they had an all-male board. That person, that woman should be saying, why is this board?
Thank you. And Gabrielle?
Well, my priority when I'm back in Paris, actually, is to focus on the new generation, young people, both at home and at Publicis, to make sure that they believe they have equal opportunities and they understand that they should work as a team in a diverse environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Helena?
Speaking as a young woman who set up her enterprise, small, humble startup from scratch after suffering a bad road accident and brain concussion, I guess I have a word or two to say about women empowerment. Remember, my fellow women friends out there, you are your own source of empowerment. Always dare to be who you are. Embrace your individuality. Stand for the integrity of your own self-identity. I think it matters more than anything. Empowerment by other women counts as well, by fostering a community of solidarity, by reaching out to those senior women leadership who you consider as your mentors. And also, I think just now I mentioned about the unity, working unitedly as a force, coherent force between the private and public sector. I spent nearly 5 years in total in Sweden, where the...
Sorry, Helena, we're going to have to move this along as much as possible.
I think if there's any policymaker down there in the audience, I would like you to support us, empower us, and improve the regulation to improve the women's quota in the corporate management.
Lovely, thank you. And Carrie, one final
Thank you. Bit. Well, the diversity means that we respect every single human being. And then, but it's not only just respecting and taking care of, but meaning that we all together to put effort to get a better solutions or better idea. So meaning that we have to all learn and get the skills of the better communications, so that our ideas could be used in the better way on the business meetings or society. So I often say that network is net that works. We get together, not only exchanging Meishi or name card, but we give each other, support each other to have the better world and society and the governance, and that's diversity.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you. Some very, very interesting and I hope helpful insights from the panelists there. So thank you very much to you again, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.